October 4th, 1990. The security guard making his rounds in the underground parking garage of the World Trade Center's North Tower had walked past the black Cadillac sedan 3 times over the past 2 days. Each time he'd noticed it sitting in the same spot, windows tinted dark, undisturbed. On his 4th pass, something made him stop and look closer. The figure in the driver's seat hadn't moved. Not once. Not in 48 hours. When the NYPD arrived and opened the door, they found Louis DiBono slumped behind the wheel, a beeper still clutched in his right hand, 7 bullet wounds. His trunk was filled with construction business records, contracts, invoices, blueprints for fireproofing work at the towers. The medical examiner would later confirm what the guard had suspected. DiBono had been sitting there, dead, for 2 to 3 days. In one of the most secure buildings in New York City, a made man in the Gambino crime family had been executed, and nobody had noticed until the smell started seeping through the ventilation system. What Louis DiBono didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his death sentence had been recorded 11 months earlier on an FBI wiretap. On December 12, 1989, a bug planted in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy captured John Gotti's voice, cold and matter-of-fact, explaining to his consigliere, Frank Locascio, exactly why DiBono had to die. "You know why he's dying?" Gotti said, his words preserved forever on magnetic tape. "He's gonna die because he refused to come in when I called. He didn't do nothing else wrong. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about betrayal or cooperating with law enforcement or stealing from the family. Louis DiBono was going to be murdered for something far simpler and far more dangerous in John Gotti's world: disrespect." Louis the Bone DiBono had been born on May 3, 1927, in an era when the construction industry in New York was entirely controlled by the 5 families. By 1990, at 63 years old, he'd carved out an enviable position in both worlds. As a soldier in the Gambino crime family, he had connections that opened doors most contractors spent lifetimes trying to access. But DiBono wasn't just another mobster dabbling in construction. He understood the industry, the materials, the labor, the contracts, the union relationships that determined whether a job succeeded or failed. His crowning achievement had been securing the contract to install fireproofing foam on the steel infrastructure of the Twin Towers. This wasn't some neighborhood job. This was the World Trade Center, 2 of the tallest buildings on Earth, and DiBono's company controlled one of the most critical safety components keeping those buildings standing. The work had begun back in 1969, and DiBono's operation had not only handled the initial installation, but had also secured the contract to remove asbestos-containing materials when city officials ordered a switch to new compounds. The money was extraordinary: multi-million-dollar contracts, steady work for years, minimal oversight from authorities who assumed construction at the World Trade Center was handled by reputable professionals. And like many mob-connected contractors, DiBono had found ways to maximize profits. Years later, forensic investigators would discover he'd cut corners, spraying fireproofing foam improperly onto rusted steel where it would eventually slough off, leaving entire sections inadequately protected. But in the late 1980s, nobody was asking questions. Business was booming. DiBono was also business partners with Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, John Gotti's underboss. The two ran several construction companies together, and Gravano valued DiBono's expertise and ability to generate consistent income. In the mob-dominated construction industry, DiBono's connections and contracts made him valuable. Gravano trusted him, respected him, counted on him to keep money flowing upward through the organization. The problem had everything to do with the man who'd seized control of the Gambino family in December 1985, John Joseph Gotti. When Gotti orchestrated Paul Castellano's assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse and took over as boss, he brought a management style that differed dramatically from his predecessors. Carlo Gambino had been quiet, strategic, invisible. Paul Castellano had been businesslike, focused on white-collar crimes. But John Gotti was flashy, public, obsessed with respect. He wanted to be seen, recognized. He wanted every member of the Gambino family to understand his authority was absolute and unquestionable. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti instituted a new rule. All capos had to meet with him at the Ravenite Social Club once a week. No exceptions, no excuses. This decision would prove catastrophic for Gotti's freedom. It allowed the FBI to systematically record the Gambino hierarchy, building evidence that would destroy him. But it also created a new dynamic. Gotti wasn't content to let soldiers operate independently as long as they kicked up earnings. He wanted to see them, wanted them to show their faces, to demonstrate week after week that they recognized his authority. For Louis DiBono, this requirement posed a significant problem. He was legitimately busy. Construction sites to manage, workers to supervise, union officials to negotiate with, inspectors to deal with. His operations didn't follow a neat schedule allowing for weekly trips to Manhattan. Jobs ran over, emergencies happened, weather delayed work. Showing up for meetings in Little Italy every week wasn't just inconvenient, it interfered with actually making money. The first time Gotti summoned DiBono and DiBono didn't show, maybe Gotti let it slide. Maybe someone explained DiBono was dealing with an urgent situation at a job site. The second time, there were probably warnings passed through intermediaries. Messages suggesting the boss was getting irritated that DiBono needed to make showing up a priority. But DiBono kept not showing. Not because he was actively defying Gotti, he simply didn't think it was that important. He was making money, kicking up to Gravano, who kicked up to Gotti. He wasn't causing problems. He was just too busy running operations to attend weekly meetings that accomplished nothing productive. What DiBono failed to understand was that, to John Gotti, the meetings weren't about productivity. They were about respect, about demonstrating that when the boss summoned you, you came immediately, without question, without excuses about being busy or having other priorities. The content didn't matter. What mattered was showing up, showing your face, showing you understood who was in charge. As DiBono continued ignoring summons, Gotti's irritation transformed into something more dangerous. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, where reputation determined survival, DiBono's absences sent a message Gotti couldn't tolerate. It suggested DiBono didn't respect his authority. It implied DiBono thought his construction business was more important than obligations to the boss. Worst of all, it created an example others might follow. If DiBono could ignore summons without consequences, why should anyone else show up? By December 1989, Gotti had made his decision. The FBI bug captured the conversation that sealed DiBono's fate. Gotti was meeting with Frankie Locke Locascio, discussing various family business including murders of Robert DiBernardo and Louis Melito. Then the conversation turned to Louis DiBono. He didn't rob nothing, Gotti began, voice steady and emotionless. You know why he's dying? He's gonna die because he refused to come in when I called. He didn't do nothing else wrong. Locascio asked if Gotti had scheduled the meeting yet. No, Gotti replied. Gonna have it tomorrow. Locascio predicted DiBono would show up with $50,000, attempting to smooth things over. But Gotti wasn't interested. But I wouldn't take nothing, Gotti said. The cocksucker, I wouldn't take nothing from him. He's gonna get killed because he disobeyed coming. The sentence trailed off, but the message was clear. DiBono's fate was sealed not for what he'd done, but for what he'd failed to do. What's remarkable about this conversation is its casual nature. Gotti wasn't angry or emotional. He was simply explaining a business decision. DiBono had disrespected him, and that meant death. No negotiation, no second chance. The only questions were when and who would do it. John Gotti ordered Bobby Borriello to organize the murder. Borriello was Gotti's favorite bodyguard and chauffeur, a feared enforcer who stood 6'3". Borriello had been involved in numerous murders, and Gotti trusted him with sensitive contracts requiring discretion and efficiency. Borriello assembled a three-man team. The triggerman would be Charles Carneglia, a soldier who'd been affiliated associated with the Gambino family for over 3 decades. Carneglia was part of Gotti's inner circle of hitmen, professionals called when someone absolutely had to die. He'd committed multiple murders, including the 1976 killing of a Brooklyn court officer scheduled to testify against him and the 1983 stabbing of a Gambino associate. Carneglia was cold, methodical, ruthless. He didn't hesitate. He didn't feel remorse. He did what needed to be done and moved on. Joining him was Kevin McMahon, a mob associate who'd been unofficially adopted by Carneglia's brother John during the 1970s. McMahon, derisively nicknamed the Midget because of his small stature, would play a support role. Years later, when McMahon became a government witness, he would provide crucial testimony about what happened in that parking garage. The team began tracking DiBono's movements. They needed the perfect moment and location, somewhere he'd be alone, where they could approach without attracting attention, where they could kill and escape before anyone realized what happened. The World Trade Center's underground parking garage emerged as ideal. DiBono visited regularly for his fireproofing business. He parked in the same general area, and despite being part of one of the most iconic buildings in America, the garage had surprisingly lax security. No video surveillance cameras covered most parking areas. Guards didn't make regular patrols. It was possible to commit murder and simply walk away. On October 4, 1990, Louis DiBono drove his Cadillac into the parking garage beneath the North Tower just like hundreds of times before. He had his beeper clipped to his belt, trunk loaded with documents, contracts to review, invoices to process, blueprints for ongoing projects. Maybe he was planning to meet with Port Authority officials. Maybe he had an appointment with subcontractors. We'll never know what he was thinking in those final moments. Charles Carneglia and his team were waiting. They'd positioned themselves near where DiBono typically parked. As DiBono sat in his Cadillac, probably reviewing documents or making notes, Carneglia approached. No dramatic confrontation, no final words or explanations, no chance for DiBono to understand what was happening. Carneglia simply raised his weapon and fired. 7 shots echoed through the concrete cavern. The sound reverberated off walls and ceiling, but in the ambient noise, cars entering and exiting, engines running, people talking, the gunshots didn't register as unusual. DiBono slumped over in the driver's seat, still holding his beeper, dead before his brain could process what was happening. Charles Carneglia and Kevin McMahon walked out of the garage, emerged onto the streets of Lower Manhattan, and disappeared into crowds of office workers and tourists. Behind them, Louis DiBono sat dead in his Cadillac, and life in the World Trade Center continued normally. People rode elevators, meetings happened, business was conducted, and nobody noticed that several levels below ground, a corpse was beginning to decompose in a luxury sedan. For 2 days, maybe 3, Louis DiBono sat undiscovered. The parking garage was busy enough that his Cadillac didn't stand out as abandoned. Security guards walked past multiple times without investigating. Tinted windows prevented anyone from seeing clearly inside. It wasn't until the smell became noticeable that anyone thought to check the vehicle. When the body was finally discovered, it exposed a shocking vulnerability in World Trade Center security. How could a car sit for 3 days without anyone checking? How could a murder be committed without witnesses, surveillance footage, physical evidence? The NYPD launched an investigation, but there was nothing to investigate. No video, no eyewitnesses, no ear witnesses who'd recognize the sounds as gunshots. The murder seemed destined to join the long list of unsolved mob hits. But DiBono's murder had already been solved. 11 months before it happened, that FBI bug had captured everything. Gotti explaining his reasoning, Locascio discussing the planned meeting, the casual acknowledgement that DiBono would be killed not for any serious transgression, but simply for not showing up when called. Federal prosecutors had the smoking gun, Gotti's own words ordering a murder, recorded in his own voice, with no ambiguity. The tapes captured more than just the DiBono murder. They documented Gotti discussing killings of Louis Milito and Robert DiBernardo. They recorded him acknowledging his role as boss and his approval of criminal activities. They caught him bad-mouthing Sammy Gravano, accusing his own underboss of greed and creating a threatening power base. The tapes were a prosecutor's dream, clear, unambiguous evidence of criminal conspiracy and murder impossible to explain away. But the tapes created an unexpected consequence. When Sammy Gravano heard the recordings and realized Gotti was attempting to blame him for murders Gotti himself had ordered, something fundamental shifted in Gravano's loyalty. He'd been Gotti's underboss, most trusted advisor, partner in running the family. He'd helped orchestrate the Castellano assassination. He'd stood by Gotti through investigations and trials, and now Gotti was preparing to sacrifice him. In late 1991, Salvatore Gravano made the decision that would shock the American Mafia and seal Gotti's fate. He agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. He would testify against his boss, providing insider details about Gambino operations and confirming the meaning of the FBI tapes. It was unprecedented. An underboss, a man who'd participated in 19 murders, turning state's evidence against the boss he'd served. On July 18, 1991, John Gotti, Frank Locascio, and Salvatore Gravano were indicted on racketeering charges. The indictment included 12 predicate acts and multiple other crimes. Among those charges, the murder of Louis DiBono. When the trial began in early 1992, it became a media sensation. John Gotti, the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the most famous mob boss in America, finally facing charges that might stick. The evidence was overwhelming. FBI tapes played in open court, letting jurors hear Gotti's voice explaining why DiBono had to die. Then Sammy Gravano spent 6 days providing devastating testimony about the inner workings of the Gambino family, confirming Gotti's role in ordering murders, explaining how the family operated, connecting dots between tape recordings and actual crimes. On April 2, 1992, after a 6-week trial, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Gotti was convicted of murder, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, tax evasion. Frank Locascio was convicted as well. Gotti was sentenced to life without parole. After DiBono's death, his lucrative construction businesses and World Trade Center contracts were taken over by Sammy Gravano, exactly as quietly planned. The fireproofing operations, construction companies, steady income, it all went to Gravano, making him wealthier and more powerful. It was empire building that had made Gotti suspicious in the first place, and it would later emerge that Gotti had viewed DiBono's murder as serving two purposes: punishing disrespect while transferring valuable business assets. Bobby Borriello, who'd organized the hit, didn't survive to see Gotti's conviction. On April 13, 1991, 7 months after DiBono's murder, Borriello was shot to death outside his Bensonhurst home. The hit was ordered by Lucchese underboss Anthony Casso as part of endless cycles of mob violence. Borriello was shot twice in the head and 5 times in the torso, dying beside his Lincoln while his wife and 2 young children were inside, probably hearing the gunshots. Charles Carneglia, the triggerman, managed to avoid prosecution for years. But on February 7, 2008, nearly 18 years after DiBono's murder, Carneglia was arrested as part of a massive federal indictment targeting 62 alleged members of the Gambino, Genovese, and Bonanno families. The charges included DiBono's murder, along with 4 other killings during his decades in organized crime. In March 2009, after a 6-week trial in Brooklyn federal court, a jury convicted Charles Carneglia of racketeering conspiracy, including predicate acts of murder, murder conspiracy, felony murder, robbery, kidnapping. Evidence included testimony from Kevin McMahon, who'd been part of the hit team and eventually became a government witness. On September 17, 2009, Judge Jack B. Weinstein sentenced Carnelia to life imprisonment. He's currently serving that sentence in a federal penitentiary. Frank Locascio, Gotti's consigliere present for that December 1989 conversation, also received life. Now 78, Locascio has spent decades filing appeals, claiming he'd opposed DiBono's murder and that additional words he'd spoken, words that would exonerate him, were never properly transcribed. Courts have consistently rejected these claims. The tape is clear. The conversation is unambiguous. Locascio remains in federal prison. John Gotti died on June 10, 2002, at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61, ravaged by throat cancer. The man who'd loved the spotlight, who'd reveled in being America's most famous mobster, died alone behind bars, having spent his final decade in supermax isolation, never seeing freedom after his 1992 conviction. His funeral drew thousands in Queens, but the dapper Don was buried wearing a prison jumpsuit. Louis DiBono's story became a footnote in Gotti's downfall, but his murder revealed something essential about organized crime during that era and about Gotti's particular psychology. DiBono wasn't killed because he'd stolen or betrayed secrets. He wasn't killed because of violent disputes or unpaid debts. He wasn't killed because he'd challenged Gotti's authority. He was killed because he didn't show up when summoned. That passive disrespect of being too busy with legitimate business to attend weekly meetings was worthy of death. The bitter irony is that DiBono's murder contributed directly to Gotti's destruction. If Gotti had let it go, if he'd accepted DiBono's money or found some other way to address perceived disrespect, that FBI bug might never have captured the smoking gun prosecutors needed. But Gotti's ego and obsession with respect led him to order murder for the pettiest reason. And in explaining that decision to Frank Locascio in what he thought was private conversation, he handed federal prosecutors exactly what they needed to destroy him. The parking spot where DiBono's Cadillac sat for 3 days is long gone, buried beneath rubble of September 11, 2001. The towers themselves fell in an attack that killed nearly 3,000. Investigators later suggested inadequate fireproofing in the towers, the same fireproofing DiBono's company had improperly installed, may have been a contributing factor in their catastrophic collapse. Whether true or not, the symbolism is inescapable. The man who cut corners protecting the Twin Towers was murdered in the parking garage beneath them, and years later, those towers fell while inadequately protected. The world of organized crime that produced men like John Gotti and Louis DiBono has largely faded. The Gambino family still exists, but it's a shadow of former power. The days of flashy mob bosses holding court and ordering executions over respect are mostly over. Law enforcement's use of RICO, electronic surveillance, cooperating witnesses, and aggressive prosecution decimated the traditional American mafia. The old codes governing how made men behaved, how disputes were resolved, how respect was maintained, all of that crumbled under weight of life sentences and realization that loyalty was one way. But Louis DiBono's story remains a stark reminder of how that world operated. A successful businessman connected to powerful people, running multi-million-dollar operations that generated enormous wealth, and none of it mattered when he made the fatal mistake of thinking he was too important, too busy, too valuable to show up when John Gotti summoned him. He ignored those summons, once, twice, 3 times, maybe more. And for that crime of disrespect, for that failure to demonstrate proper deference, he paid with his life, sitting dead in his car for 3 days before anyone noticed he was gone. John Gotti got what he wanted. Louis DiBono died for refusing to come in when called. But the evidence of that murder, captured on FBI tapes and confirmed by Sammy Gravano's testimony, ensured Gotti himself would spend the rest of his life in a cage, his empire destroyed, his reputation shattered, remembered not as the powerful boss he imagined, but as the man whose own voice and own underboss finally brought him down. In the end, John Gotti's obsession with respect destroyed him just as surely as it destroyed Louis DiBono, proving that in the world they both inhabited, ego and pride were just as deadly as any gun.